Welcome to Driving the Line, the pursuit of safety, where we talk about the real issues out on the road, focus on safe driving, and learn industry best practices from your hosts Kenny Ray, Mike Bohan, and Jim Seibert, in the hopes that by driving the line, we get more drivers home safe and sound. This podcast was made possible by Marsh McLennan Agency.
Good day, everyone, and welcome to Driving the Line, the pursuit of safety. Whether you've been with us from the beginning or are joining us for the first time, we're glad that you're here. I'm Jim Seibert, and today, along with my friends and co-hosts Kenny Ray and Mike Bohan, we'll be discussing the National Safety Council's initiative, National Safety Month, which is this June. The National Safety Council stood up this initiative 27 years ago, and this year's weekly topics cover emergency preparedness, slips, trips, and falls, heat-related illness, and hazard recognition. Gentlemen, I like what the NSC has put together this year. The topic-wise, and I think it's pretty relevant to what's going on across the general industries, construction, and the trucking. In preparation for this podcast, I spent quite a bit of time on their website. It appears that they've got a plethora of educational materials for their members to utilize. So I encourage the listeners, if you guys are members, if you're thinking about becoming a member, go take a look at what they have up there and the materials that pertain to the relevant topics of this month. Guys, I know we have these 4 topics to expand on a little bit, but I want to try something a little different. I want to just talk about what a practical approach to this month could look like from a business perspective, and maybe talk about stretching the weekly topics into an event or an activity that's outside the normal safety meeting. So, hey, what great ideas, what have you seen in the past work? What kind of safety stand-ups or stand-downs or what best practices have you seen successful safety programs and program coordinators do in initiative months or topics like this one?
You know, Jim, and Mike and I both will respond to that and share some very pragmatic tips because we've both been involved in these kind of deals. But you touched on one thing that I think bears repeating, and that is the amount of resources that are available through the National Safety Council. If you're not a member of the National Safety Council, they have tons of free resources you don't even have to be a member of, and they're very, very good, very high quality. If you're a member, you get their premium stuff, which is mostly just more. It's not really any better material. So I want to encourage people to get on the National Safety Council website and take advantage of the free materials that are there. Now, talking about National Safety Month, this is something very dear to my heart. Y'all know before I came on with MMA, I was a safety director for 5 years at a large hazmat trucking company. And we observe National Safety Month every year. A lot of people think it's not applicable to the transportation industry, but nothing could be further from the truth. It's very applicable. And the 4 topics that they picked this year, I just thought back to how we incorporated these 4 things into our month. And basically, we have a lot of safety directors and owners of trucking companies that listen to the podcast. And I want to challenge those owners and those safety directors, do something special this year. Observe this month, publicize it, put up posters, put up, however you communicate with your drivers, your terminal managers, your fleet people, your mechanics, advertise and publicize this month. And the 4 topics you mentioned, emergency preparedness, slips, trips, and falls, heat-related illnesses or heat-related incidents, and hazard recognition are all applicable to the trucking industry. Y'all know I come out of the hazmat world, and so I always kind of look at things through the lens of hazmat. And on emergency preparedness, you're talking about best practices and neat things I've seen done. Coming out of the hazmat world, one thing I would see a lot of tank carriers do during this month is they would coordinate with their, what we call LEPC, their local emergency planning committee, which is a function of all things the Environmental Protection Agency. It's where what we do if we have a hazmat spill somewhere. So they would invite the local fire department, the local police department to physically come down to the yard. They'd put on a fish fry or a hamburger cookout, and they would invite all the drivers' families, wives, kids, come down, make it a family event. And they would have the fire trucks down there, and they would let those firemen walk around and look at all the equipment, the placarded trailers that were on the yard, let those firefighters get familiar. Hey, if there's ever an incident here, what are we going to be responding to? The kids are there looking at fire trucks, and we would always wash a truck and a trailer and have it all cleaned up and let the kids get up in it and honk the air horn. But the point is, you would incorporate a community-wide event by bringing your firefighters, your local police officers down. You would have drivers' families, and the whole purpose of it was discussing emergency preparedness. If we ever have anything happen here at the yard, what are we going to do? And then as part of that, we would talk about slips, trips, and falls. Truck drivers are notorious for getting hurt falling down. They fall down getting in and out of the cab of the tractor. They slip on a rock walking across a parking lot at a truck stop or the yard at the terminal. If you're in the flatbed business, you're constantly getting up on trailers and putting tarps on loads or doing tie downs. And we get a ton of drivers hurt every year from slips, trips, and falls. Of one thing, and I'll tell you talking about pragmatic things, we found there were a lot of drivers getting hurt in the tanker industry going up and down the ladder on cargo tanks if they had to top load and had to open the dome lid, or they had to vent the top of the trailer. And we found a simple solution to that was making sure they wore a boot that had a defined heel. If they had a smooth soled shoe, they were much more likely to slip on the ladder. So we mandated all of our drivers, we gave them a variety of choices, but they had to wear a boot that had a defined heel on it. Heat-related illness, obviously in the South, in the summer with humidity, particularly drivers that have to wear PPE while they're unloading. You get a guy or a gal out there wearing basically a rubber suit, an acid suit, while they're unloading a load of acid. It may take 3 hours to pump that product off that trailer. And they're required to be in attendance by regulatory requirement. They have to be right there by that valve so they can shut it down. So always those things of keeping them hydrated, providing water, providing, electrolyte drinks, having shade available to them, give them defined rest periods. And we kidded because on an earlier podcast, we joked around a little bit about those urine color charts. And Jim, you're an old veteran. You come out of the Army, and the ones we used to use were originated in the military, but we put those things up faithfully, about April or May, every year, because it starts getting hot in the South by then, and we'd leave them up till October, November, and we just have them in both the men's and the women's restroom. And we would just tell guys and gals, hey, if you're out working in the heat, whenever you go to the restroom, you just look at your urine stream compared to that chart. And if the color's not right, let's get some water in you, let's get some Gatorade in you, let's do something to get that back. It's just an easy way to check. And then hazard recognition, and I'm going to yield to Mike, but on hazard recognition, we would always use the National Safety Month as a time to reinforce our near miss or our close call reporting procedure that we had in the company, just to reiterate to everybody, safety is everybody's business. It's not just the safety department. We want drivers, we want mechanics, we want dispatchers, we want our office staff. If you see something that is a danger that needs to be fixed, say something about it, and let's get something done about it. And we would always use this month to reinforce our commitment to stop work authority, that any employee that saw something that was an imminent hazard that could get somebody hurt had the right, had the authority, all the way from the owner down, to say, time out, stop, this is fixing to get somebody hurt. Let's talk about this. So I'm a huge fan of this month. I think it's very applicable to the trucking industry. And I think there's tons of ways that safety directors and safety staffs can make this a very, very positive thing for their company. And again, if people need ideas, reach out to us, reach out to one of the three of us, shoot us an email, get hold of us. But again, that National Safety Council website has tons of great resources at no cost that these safety directors can use.
Kenny, you said a couple of things there that I just want to kind of circle back around on, because I firmly believe in it too. One, a lot of times when in the trucking industry and probably other industries as well, but specifically in our industry, because that's who we're talking to. We're talking to trucking companies out there, truck drivers and owners, safety directors. A lot of times when we look at our focus of a month like this, we think about the drivers. Well, we want to focus on the drivers. We want to get them trained. But you had mentioned, hey, get your entire company involved. Everybody in that company, whether it's the office staff, the maintenance staff, the maintenance staff, whoever that may be, get them included in this, because it really is a company-wide event that you can have. Because I've seen, in my previous life, different companies, I've seen some of the worst work comp claims I've seen came from people that weren't drivers. They were office staff that had a fall or something like that. So everybody is going to benefit from this in the company. And another thing you mentioned was, I like that idea of bringing families in. I've got customers that and clients that I work with when they get together for this month, and they're talking about safety with their employees. They bring their families in, they bring their spouses in, tell them to bring their kids if they've got them, and make that an event. And it's just something that seems like it tends to hit home a little harder. When you can come in, you can talk about safety. If the husband is the driver or the mechanic or the person working at the company and their spouse is sitting there with them, and we as a company are saying, we want you to be as safe as possible. We want you to come home at night. That spouse is going to appreciate that. And it's going to mean a lot more for that family. So I just appreciate you saying that stuff. A couple of things as we go down through those topics, which Kenny, you hit on all of them, and I just wanted to touch base on a few, because as I was thinking about them, we've got the emergency preparedness, the slip, trips, and falls, which is a huge deal in the trucking industry, the heat-related illness, and the hazard recognition. One of the things for us, which Kenny, you mentioned, that the slips, trips, and falls, this is something that, whether it's that driver up and down on a trailer, or in and out of the cab, or walking across the parking lot, that's something that is a hazard for them. But at our place of business is a hazard as well. And I remember years ago, I worked with a man named Dan Randall, and he always would talk about this specific instance. He went in to do a safety meeting with a company, and it was during the winter months. And when he got to the safety meeting, there were people there already in the building, and it was snowing. So when he walked up, first of all, there was snow on the steps. And then he looked at the railing, and there was snow on both railings going up the steps. So when he went in and talked to the folks in the safety meeting and people came in, he'd mentioned, okay, he recognized the hazard there and said, one, the steps hadn't been cleared of snow, and two, nobody used the railing going up the steps because there was still snow all the way up the railing.
Right.
So he talked about that hazard recognition, and then he talked about 3 points of contact. So it just all kind of blended in together. And it was just a great message. And I always appreciated him telling that story, because that's a little thing that a lot of people just walk right by and not notice. But just like you were saying, Kenny, it's everybody's job to recognize if they see something, to say something if it's unsafe. That's a prime example of that. And I like that story as well, because we've got this safety month in the middle of the year when the weather's warm and it's nice, but this is something that should be carried out throughout the year. This could be like a springboard into a month-to-month thing where we're talking with our employees, not just our drivers, about being safe, and taking these topics and expanding on them, not just in the month of June, but as we go throughout the year, because it's really important that we're talking to our folks throughout the year. It's not just that we want to be safe in 1 month out of the year. Obviously, we want this to continue. So appreciate what you shared there, Kenny. It's and Jim as well. I mean, I always learn something from you guys when I listen to you talk. So I appreciate your input. But that was just a few things I thought of when we were preparing for this, and as Kenny was talking, that I thought I'd share too.
Those are pretty great examples of placing special focus and time investment into a company's safety culture and the employees. So I thank you guys for that. I'm going to save my comments of these best practices to when we divide up these 4 topics here. So I do want to leave the listeners with some insider perspective of the type of thoughts or ideas that come to us when we regard these 4 topics. And we've touched on it a little bit. Now we're going to make it a little bit applicable and give our listeners some nuggets to try out this month at the facility. So guys, feel free as always, jump right on in here and show this old grain elevator guy some tricks of the trucker safety trade. So the first topic for the first week of the month of June, emergency preparedness. Kenny, you mentioned it. I'm an Army guy. I've been in the grain industry for a while, but the military was a strong part of my background and the discipline that I feel now and in the regulatory world. I went military on this one pretty quick. And all of these things, we hear emergency action plan or that term, but the word preparedness really took me to a couple of my favorite quotes that I used to think about as an officer. And the old sayings of failing to plans, planning to fail, or wars are won in the planning phase. The best laid out plans don't survive the first enemy contact. And everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth. That's probably my favorite one. So those kind of thoughts came to me in waves as I sat here and kind of meditated on, all right, emergency preparedness. What's OSHA got to say? Well, OSHA says it's a requirement that we've got an emergency action plan for our company, right? And it's got to include associated sites if you got satellite facilities, things of that nature. Plans are really, really great on paper. And everybody can have a generic emergency action plan. But the preparedness part comes in the drills and the working of the plan. We want to exercise the emergency action plan in such a way that it becomes a second nature to the employees, not of what the emergency might be. That we don't want that to become the second nature. The second nature is, how do I execute the emergency action plan? How do I thumb through that document, that 1-pager or that 20-pager? And is my emergency action plan set up in such a way that it points the user of it to the flow chart of what is my next step? So my key takeaways on emergency preparedness is, yes, have an emergency action plan. It's a requirement. Yes, you need to work that plan. And in my previous management roles, we would create those scenarios, much like Mike and you guys have both mentioned. We would invite the fire department over every 6 months, kind of at a minimum, and we just call it hot dogs and hamburgers. We'd try to do it outside company hours. We'd try to do it on a Saturday. Families were always invited. Families of the firefighters were invited. And we would do complete walkthroughs of the facility. We'd provide them the most updated emergency action plan. And me and the fire chief would have already created the situation we wanted them to react to. And it was, they're going to come in, they're going to get an exercise, we're going to feed them. Their families feel appreciated. Our families feel appreciated. And knowing that we all take safety seriously, and we want them to be very familiar with our facility and the types of emergencies that could happen there. So my thing that I want the listeners to hear is work that plan, drill that plan. Anything from you guys?
No, that's the same thing we see in trucking. Is oftentimes they have a plan, it's sitting on a shelf, and they never ever practice it. They never ever have drills. And the 3 areas on an emergency action plan that are really applicable to the trucking industry is clearly fire. Every employee at the facility needs to know what to do if there's a fire on site. All 3 of us are in different parts of the country. Mike's in Missouri, you're in Oklahoma, and I'm in Texas, but we all live in states that have severe weather. Our employees need to know what to do in case of severe weather. And sadly, that we have to do this, but it's the reality of our times. Our employees need to know what to do if we have a workplace violence or an active shooter situation. Yeah. So at a minimum, a trucking company's emergency action plan ought to address those three things: fire, severe weather, and an active shooter situation. And it's incumbent upon the safety director, the safety department, or whoever wears that hat, even if they don't have that title, to ensure that, number one, that plan's up to date, it's thorough, it does what it's supposed to do, but then the employees understand it, and that's only done through training and drills.
Yeah, and you brought up something there, Kenny, that I kind of want to throw this back at you guys and get your thoughts, because there's a lot of times that I will visit with companies on the trucking side, and we look at our safety directors. A lot of times they've got the FMCSA, they've got DOT regulations in their mind, things like that. Sometimes this emergency preparedness plan, the stuff that happens in the office or in the shop, sometimes there's not clear definition of who's in charge of that, or who's driving this, who's driving the fact that, we don't have an emergency preparedness plan, let's get one, or who's driving the fact that we need to do those drills and we need to have our employees prepared. So I think that's something that companies need to take a look at and sit down and discuss, because sometimes this kind of falls through the cracks, because, if it's a safety director on a trucking company, they've got a DOT background, they may not be, this may not be where they're thinking, where their headspace is at. So I don't know what you guys see on a regular basis, but I just had a conversation here a couple of weeks ago, and this was a gap that we found. It was, hey, we're not prepared here. We've got some issues we need to address. And it was a lot of the emergency preparedness and having a safety program that was outside of just DOT regulations and what the trucks and the drivers were worried about.
Yeah, you bet.
Good stuff. All right, next point: slips, trips, and falls. Well, I don't know about how this affected you guys, but OSHA really flipped the general industry on its head when they brought out the new walking and working surface, or the subpart D standard. And I am still, since 2016 when this came out, I'm still seeing mass confusion around fixed ladders, hand and stair rail changes, and working platforms in general. My first suggestion for my customers is really always conduct an assessment of your site. Elevations you need to reach, and backwards plan the safest way on how to get there. Kenny, you already mentioned it. The tankers that have ladders on the side and the elevation of getting in and out of a cab. I think grain haulers, rock haulers, you name it. Anytime people are going up or potentially, cleaning out trailers, elevated work is there. And having a proper ladder to get there, one that's approved by design and function, and then footwear, having that cleated heel or that defined heel to keep a slip coming off of there. An interesting statistic that I read just yesterday: the lifetime odd of dying in a fall is 1 in 98. That just baffles me. 1 in 98. That's your lifetime odd of dying in a fall. And I know of at least 3 folks that have had some real significant injuries, life-changing injuries, falling off a 3-foot step stool.
Yeah. And for us in the trucking industry, it doesn't often result in a fatality, but Mike and I both can tell you there are some enormous, in terms of financial workers' comp claims that come from a truck driver falling down and ended up having to have hip surgery or a knee replaced or spinal issues. So it's a big problem in our trucking industry. This whole idea of trips, slips, and falls is a massive, massive problem in our industry, and it comes in a variety of different ways. You mentioned about ladders. So many trucking companies have their own shops, and even though Mike and I always yield to you as our OSHA guy, and we're tickled to death we have an OSHA expert on our staff, but Mike and I go out and do mock audits of trucking companies. Invariably, we'll walk through the shop And one of the things I see, in addition to general housekeeping that could result in somebody tripping and falling down, but I always look at their ladders. And most times their ladders are just ragged. They don't have the proper feet on them. They're not marked with their load rating, and you just sit and say, y'all need a new ladder. That ladder's not going to cut it. And well, it does a job, but the first time somebody gets hurt on it, then they come back to the regulatory issues with it. So slips, trips, and falls is a big deal for us in the trucking industry. We normally think about getting in and out of the truck because there's a lot of injuries that come from that. But the catastrophic ones that I've seen in terms of workers' comp claim and a genuine injury for the driver is where they're doing something as simple as walking across the yard at the terminal or walking across the yard at a truck stop, and they turn their ankle on a piece of rock or caliche rock or a busted up concrete. And the next thing you know, they fall. And then the next thing you know, they're having hip replacement surgery or spinal surgery. And those become very, very expensive procedures.
So I'm aware of a study that covered a lot of different companies, and slips, trips, and falls over the last 5 years have been the number one cause of workplace injuries. The slips, trips, and falls, and the wounds happen to the wrist, to the elbow, knees, and ankles. And that's just to the same level and to the lower level. And it's year after year after year. And Kenny, you and I have been in some facility walkthroughs together, and you hear me say something like, when the stars align, or when we stack hazards upon hazards. And you just mentioned it there. When we are on a walking and working surface and we introduce a trip hazard into that, we have just contaminated what should be a working area where an employee should feel safe. But we introduce the hazard by leaving something in our path of travel or on our working platform. So good thoughts there. Thanks for sharing. Heat-related illness. And from our previous podcast, we know that this can be an absolute problem. It's so much so that OSHA identified it as a hazard to be mitigated. They created a national emphasis program for outdoor and indoor heat-related hazards in April of 2022, and we're just kind of carrying it forward. I encourage listeners, if you're coming ahead and just joining us now, go back and listen to that heat-related illness one, because that's a significant factor across our clients and in the industries that we represent. And so it's going to be applicable to you. We hit on hazard recognition and we expanded a little bit. And the picture, it's a little comical. You ever looked in the fridge and you're just looking for the ketchup bottle? You're like, hey, anybody seen the ketchup? And your wife or significant other, family member from the other room says, yeah, it's on the second drawer down. And if it was any closer to you, it would have bit you. But you just couldn't see it. And maybe it's because that's the 5th time or the 100th time that you've opened up that fridge door, but somebody moved it from its normal spot. Or it's always there, but somebody always takes it out and puts it on the counter for you when you need it. But the point is, there's something in our mind that causes us to miss it. And my takeaway that I want the listeners to get today is, when we're used to something, we pass it and we miss it. And we're so used to it being there that, and our other employees are the same way. They probably see it and pass it more. But if we don't have our safety goggles on, we can't recognize the hazard that's there. Or it has been trained to us that it doesn't represent a hazard that we can picture because it's never done it before. So bringing in a fresh set of eyes, bringing in a sister facility to come in, or a sister company, or us as external auditors coming in and bringing that fresh set of eyes can really bring about some awareness to things that we might have been passing. And OSHA has a really great tool on their website. It's called the Hazard Identification and Assessment Tool. I encourage you guys to check it out. Guys, I know you've already hit on hazard recognition a little bit. Anything more to add on that one?
Well, I like that analogy you use, that a lot of times our minds are just conditioned to think that there's not a hazard there. That saying, if it was a snake, it would have bit me. That's what I was thinking of when you were talking about that. And a lot of times that's what a hazard is like. We're not looking with critical eyes when it comes to the hazards in our workplace. And if we don't see those things, it can often cause us an issue. It kind of reminds me, I don't know if you guys have ever seen those. I don't even know what they are, but it's like a little problem or a work problem that you can do where they'll put a paragraph in and they'll take words out of it. And as your mind reads through that paragraph, it doesn't even recognize that there's words missing. Your mind just finishes it for you. And that's kind of what we get, whether it's complacency or whatever it is in our workplace. We just, we've never been hurt here before, so we think it's safe, that kind of thing. But we really have to look at things with a critical eye. And as you guys have said before, both of you, Kenny mentioned it earlier, it's everybody's responsibility. It's not just the safety director walking through and saying, well, here's a hazard or here's a hazard. It's everybody in the company. It's, if it's out in the shop, it's all the mechanics, it's the foreman out there. The driver should have that ability to be able to do that if they see something in the yard that's unsafe or they recognize something that could present a hazard, and even people in the office. So I love the analogies. Great points. Thanks for sharing that, Jim.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks, guys. It's been a great discussion today. To our listeners, if you need additional information, we encourage you to please reach out to your trusted risk consultant. In the next episode of Driving the Line, we're going to discuss trucking companies and regulatory audits. Until then, for my co-hosts Mike and Kenny, I'm Jim Seibert. Stay safe. Thank you for joining us on Driving the Line, the podcast that is always in the pursuit of safety.
That's all the time we have for this episode of Driving the Line, the Pursuit of Safety. We hope you enjoyed our discussion and thank you for listening. You can rate, review, and subscribe to Driving the Line, the Pursuit of Safety on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or any other app you're using. You can also follow Marsh McLennan Agency on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Until next time, thanks again for listening. Drive safely, everyone.